White to white, la te Kamloops, Jackie Joel and Squaquas, the Kamloops, that's Achwan, Oxford, the Sequatmunk Museum and Heritage Park, Shock Mountains, District 73. La es Wichtelman Eliapian Nakut the Sikh, to Wichtelman Dr. Dustin Louis. Welcome to the territory, Dustin Louis, for our professional D-Day on February 3rd, 2023. I'm a member of the Kamloops Indian Band. We belong to the Secwepemc Nation. The Kamloops Indian Band is one of 17 bands that make up our nation. Traditionally, we had 32 bands. The bands you don't hear about today are Empire Valley, North and South Cannon, Chalcote and Mouth, Green Timber, Upper North Thompson, Kenpesk, Big Bar, just to name a few. If there were survivors to those bands, they would have connected with the next closest band to form a band. We're known as bands, divisions, or encampments here, also campfires. We are not known as tribes or clans. The Secwepemc Museum is located here in Kamloops-Thompson. Kamloops means the meeting of the rivers on an angle or at the confluence. So Kamloops-Thompson is the people of the confluence, which is Kamloops to Secwepemc. Secwepemc or Shuswap. The Secwepemc language spoken by the Secwepemc people who occupy the unceded traditional territory of the interior of British Columbia. The traditional territory stretches from the Columbia River Valley bottoms to along the Rocky Mountains, west to the Fraser River and south to the Arrow Lakes. Majority of the Secwepemc divisions live along the river valleys. When the early explorers met with the First Nations in British Columbia, they had difficulty pronouncing the different and complex sounds of the native languages. As a result, many of the First Nations were given English names or anglicized names, such as Kamloops, known as Kamloops, known as Kamloops. The Secwepemc people would like to encourage everyone to learn and use the correct pronunciation for their name. Please remember that it takes practice and patience to learn a new language. There's so much importance to Indigenous languages as the language holds you true to who you are. The language holds much knowledge of the land, the people, and the environment. So I always encourage students and as many as possible to learn every language you can, your own languages, practice. It's very important. There's so much knowledge in our languages. Secwepemc Elia as a Temiuk sa Secwepemc na Elia. Acknowledge that we live and work on the Secwepemc Utluch, the lands of the Secwepemc people. Secwepemc Utluch is the lands of the people. It's broken down as there are many ways our language is used to be inclusive. In our language, we don't have a word for exclusion as everybody is included. This is an important day, professional development day in the school district. I would encourage you to listen to Dr. Dustin Louis and what he has to share as a keynote speaker today. And I'd like to also start us off with a Secwepemc prayer. When I pray, what change the Secwepemc, this is my way, our way of always being inclusive of our elders, our stepchems, our children, the stememals, and honoring them by starting in a good way to have our day be open and sharing. In our language, the worst word in our language you can be called is stingy, not sharing. So it's important to share and transfer knowledge to our students. If you would like, you could stand or you could sit. Either way is proper protocol. Tekelkukbe. Tekelkukbe kukstechum tiskukstechum tinswamam tekelkukbe. Creator, I thank you for our life power. Tekelkukbe. Kukstekuch, 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 hala estations. Creator, thank you, thank you, thank you for our good foods. Knuchun te chochoi te stemna eliana te milch. Creator, look after everything on our lands. Tekelkukbe knuchun te mismischen, as bipuya, as sawalsh, as salskwa. Creator, look after our four-legged, our feathered, our swimmers, our waters. La amalomans asalskwa. Our water is our medicines. Tekelkukbe knuchenta, 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 chochoi des stetlachams, chochoi des tumult, chochoi des guyaskuch, knuchenta kuch as yayats. Tekelkukbe, our creator, look after our elders, our children, our babies. Help them to be strong. Help them to strengthen themselves. Tuktsilam. May it always be this way. Eats jokes.
All right. So wait, kukwait at Mike Bowden and Squest to Sequam to Pachtek. I am the district principal for school district number 73. I'm also a member of the Whispering Pines Clinton Band here at Kamloops-Thompson. And just to a bit of an acknowledgement, because it's really good to ground ourselves in the work and the place we're at. And actually, when we do that, it really connects us to the context that we're in and the work that we do too in that contextual way as far as how it connects to identity and the learning that we do in the context of things like truth and reconciliation and those areas. So kwam kuluk yeli academics to Kamloops-Semk yeli. I just want to acknowledge and that we are zooming in today on the territory of Kamloops to Sequam. But some of you are also on the territories of the Adams Lake, Little Shuswap Lake, Nisconlith, Skijitson, and Simk, and Whispering Pines Clinton bands. So we have 7 bands that we are, as a school district, serving and in the territories of, and they're all part of Secwepemc, which is the Secwepemc Nation. And as a member of the Secwepemc Nation myself, I just like to welcome you to the nation. But I want to specifically acknowledge that I'm on to Kamloops to Secwepemc as we do this great learning process that we're going to take place with Dr. Dustin Louie. And on that note, I do want to introduce Dr. Dustin Louie. Dr. Louie is the head of NITEP. I don't know if that's the official word, Dr. Louie, but oversees NITEP as part of UBC. And we're really honored to have you here today to talk to us about a really important subject area and a really exciting time really in British Columbia for Indigenous education. I know we have a lot to go, but there's some exciting things that are happening, and a lot of that is in part to the work that you're doing too, Dr. Louie. And we're just honored to have you here today to start us off. I know we're talking about February 3rd, but to start us off in our learning on February 3rd and ground us in a good way as we learn about where things are at with Indigenous education in our school district and in the province. So Kukshechimk and welcome. I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh no, we forgot to introduce ourselves, didn't we? Sorry.
No problem.
So maybe we'll do that first, and let's start with. I'm just going to go through my screen here. So, Charmaine, if you want to introduce yourself and.
Waigt, Charmaine Wilson, Resquest, Slacta, Sechalkain, Chestalin, Sequemahulu, being moved na to Kamloops to Sequemach. My name is Charmaine Wilson. I come from the Adams Lake Reserve in Chase, BC, Chestalin, and I am today I'm in Kamloops to Sequemach, and I'm a district Aboriginal on the land resource teacher for School District 73.
Charmaine. Trudy.
My name is Trudy Nilsson. I am the District Aboriginal Resource Teacher for grades K to 7. I am a member of the Okanagan Indian Band, and I have been working in education for, this will be my 27th year in SD 73. It's crazy. Yeah. Hello, everyone.
A veteran, Cookshem, Trudy. MJ, you're up next.
Hi, my name is MJ Johnson. I am Dalkel Carrier, member of Gladstone Nation, Aboriginal education worker for School District 73 at Valley View Secondary. Thank you.
Cookshem, MJ. Bernice.
Okay, Pin from Stevens Quas, Bernice Jensen, Cooksjachumk. Hello, I'm Bernice Jensen. I work at the Kamloops Aboriginal Friendship Center as a cultural education coordinator. I work in partnership with the school district, and I do Indigenous presentations from kindergarten to grade 12 on that cover academics, English, science, socials, math, art, PE, music. And I really enjoy this job. I've been doing it for about 8 years, but I've been working with SD 73 and SD 83 for, I think it was like 27 years. So 33 years in the school district anyway. So from the Okanagan Nation, and I'm also part of the Secwepemc Nation, and I live in Kamloops, Secwepemc with my husband and children. Cooksjachumk.
Cooksjachumk, Bernice. Carolyn.
Waitakwata, Carolyn Anderson in the Quest. I am the coordinator of Aboriginal education for School District 73, and I'm just really happy to be here today and listen to Dustin Louie. Cooksjam.
I think that's everyone, Dustin, so I'm going to now turn it over to you. So Cooksjachumk.
All right, thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Really great to be here. The thing that I think about a lot, I was just having a conversation with some folks on the previous Zoom I was on, which is that, the way I think about a land acknowledgement and a welcoming is, we're making a commitment to the way we're going to engage in the rest of our work, and if we open up in using gratitude, if we open up in recognizing the First Peoples of the territory, if we open up by recognizing our responsibilities to those folks, and in getting a welcoming, I think it's a really great experience for those of us who are visitors of, being welcomed onto those places, knowing that the folks who are from there are excited to have us, all these different sort of commitments and teachings that we're sort of starting out with. And I think additionally, the way we started out, which I think can be directive for those folks in the classroom and in all types of spaces, is the idea that Indigenous knowledges are relational. And Sean Wilson writes a lot about this, where he talks about, so many different Indigenous groups around Turtle Island view knowledge as being relational. And what he means by that is that knowledge isn't in a vacuum. There isn't such thing as knowledge that just sits separate from people. All knowledge is in relation to the people who created it in the first place. So in order for us to, engage in some of our teachings, we need to take a little bit of time to get to know each other before we can get started, because that knowledge can't be separate from the people who created it in the first place. And in addition, and some of the teachings that I've learned from Cree folks that I work alongside of, is they say, Barb Burkett's one of the people who shared this with me, and I've read it in other places, where they say, when they see somebody sharing Indigenous knowledges, they see the ancestors behind them who helped create that knowledge in the first place. They see the grandmothers and aunties and grandpas who helped create that knowledge in the first place, because that's not just that knowledge that they shared, that's ancestral and intergenerational knowledge. So we see those people behind them who helped create that. So I think like in this space that we're establishing right here, we have all of us who are here and we're sort of establishing those relationships. Well, we don't have a ton of time to do it. You know, we just had a meeting yesterday with the school district and we took 3 hours to introduce ourselves and it was 14 people. And to me, like that's such a valuable use of our time because we're going to be getting in some difficult work. And if we don't establish like our own histories, our own experiences, we're not prepared to do that. And for us as Indigenous people, a lot of the time, we take so much longer of like visiting. And sometimes folks don't understand that's part of the work. And I think this that Mike modeled for us today is a way that you can think about taking that into your own teaching as well. How do you have the relational component there in your classroom? When you have community members, when you have folks like Bernice come into your classroom to share, are we giving enough time for that visiting, for those relationships to be established? Or are we bringing her in and saying, all right, now get in front of the class and start talking to everybody, and not giving that sort of requisite time for us to establish those relationships at the very beginning? So I think, thank you so much for modeling that in a good way for us. Thanks for reminding us the commitment that we have to make in doing this work and how if we're doing a line acknowledgement in our classroom and in our school, it doesn't just live in that moment that we shared it. That's a commitment we make for the rest of those days. So those same values and teachings need to be present in the ways we carry ourselves. So teaching right away from Mike, something that can be directive to your classroom or your school, whichever context you're working in. But I'll share just a little bit about me. We have a lot to cover, so I don't want to take too much time. But as we have another member from my community, but I'm Deketh as well. So coming from central BC, so my nations are Nitaban is where I'm a band member, but the community that I'm the closest to and I spent the most time as a kid is Nalewiten. So Deketh for us translates to the people who travel by water. And Nalewiten is the place where the salmon return. So a colleague of mine, Dwayne Donald, out of University of Alberta, was doing some research looking at different Indigenous communities, talking about how many of our names for our communities and names for our people are connected to the water in which we're the closest to. So, you know, I have other ancestors from Claytley Tenay, like my great-great-grandmother in the top middle and my great-grandmother in the bottom right. They're from Claytley Tenay, and that's the place where two waters meet, or the confluence of two waters. So those spaces are so important to us, our connection to water. You know, whenever you go to a conference or you meet up with some folks who are Maori from New Zealand, they'll always talk about the mountain and the water in which they're the closest associated to. And I think like we informally do the same thing because our nations are oftentimes related to the physical spaces in which we inhabit. So that physical space is both like the nation in which I belong to, but also the place in which I grew up, you know, growing up in central BC until I was 18. And also important, I think it's sort of representative in the folks who we have in the meeting today, is that I come from a place of matriarchs, and that's matrilineal. So the communities in which I come from, the women are the ones who lead. You get your status through the women in your family. So I'm mixed race, and my mom's non-Indigenous and my dad's Deketh. And in order for us to get set down in our Bethlot system, my mom had to get set down first. So that matrilineal component is incredibly important to us. And in my career, working at University of Calgary after I finished my PhD, Dr. Jackie Ottman, who's a SOTA scholar, took on that role of matriarch for so many of us in that space as well. And then being here at UBC now, Dr. Jan Hare has taken on that role for so many of us. So these ideas of matriarchs are sort of continuous through so much of the work that I've done and so much of the life that I've lived. So that sort of, those sort of teachings and that modeling of those ways of being from, you know, Evelyn, who's my great-grandmother, and Agnes, or Alu, we would say, my great-great-grandmother, really models, you know, these ways of being and the ways in which I want to carry myself within the academy as well. So as was mentioned, I'm a professor. So I'm an assistant professor here at UBC. I'm also the director of the NITEP program. I was a professor at University of Calgary before that. I do a lot of work in decolonizing education. So I work with, you know, I think 13 school districts right now across BC, a number in Alberta. Do work with a bunch of social service organizations, private organizations, government agencies, thinking about practical ways in which we can implement some of these ideas of reconciliation, decolonization, and indigenization. And, you know, as Mike was saying, we're in this incredibly exciting time where people are ready for change, and we're seeing change happen at a more rapid pace than we've ever seen it. And I think so many different folks need additional supports on these grounding fundamental ideas that we're trying to do. What do we mean when we say reconciliation? What does that look like, and what are we reconciling for? What does it mean when we say decolonization, and what does that actually look like in our practice? What does it mean when we say indigenizing, and what does that look like in our practice? Because I think so often I see in different spaces where, you know, either from the ministry or from district level, there's these commitments to this work without really clear instruction on what we mean by it. And that sometimes can fall on the teachers or school leaders to then try to figure that out and then take up that work. So I think like this really clear, instructive approach to it can be really helpful in ways that we can think about it. And in this hour we spend together, my hope is that we can establish this like foundation of the one way in which we can envision these ideas and then begin thinking about how to enact them. You know, most of our work is going to be in the area of decolonizing is what we're going to look at, because I think that's such a productive space of change. And I think it's one of the ones that's the most misunderstood of what we actually mean by it. And I think if folks can get some, you know, the will is there for so many people to want to do this work, they just don't know where to start. And I think if we share some of these ideas, it gives people some of these foundations of where they can begin in some of the work, or where they can continue on with a lot of the great work that's happening already. So that's just a little bit about me, but let's get into it. So as part of the land acknowledgement, it's important for me to recognize the territory that I'm on right now, which is coming to you from Musqueam territory. And it's not the territory where my people are from, but I'm so appreciative to be a guest in this space. And one of the ways in which I think about being a good guest is to learn the knowledges of the people who are from these territories and try to embody them in the work that I'm doing. So this can happen for you folks who are teaching in these districts where it may not be your home community, may not be Indigenous, but you're thinking like, what are the ways in which I can live up to these commitments I'm making in the land acknowledgement? And one of them for me is, can I learn from the Indigenous folks in these territories, find out what's appropriate for me to use, and then try to embody some of these knowledges with some of the teaching and learning that I do. And one of the ways we can do that is by using this model of peace that I've learned from the Musqueam folks, specifically from Diamond Point. I learned about it in the orientation session that we did, where she talked about how this flag that she created is this representation of this Musqueam tradition of putting your paddles up when you're coming into their territory. And this lets people know that you're coming in with peace, you're coming in as a friend, you're coming in with care. And it sort of lets people, if you see someone coming in, you're just unsure of who they are, they put their paddles up and they're saying, hey, we're coming here in peace. I sort of think about a reverse situation, not the reverse situation, but when I went to New Zealand years ago, I was told by a friend before we went that you need to be really intentional because the Maori folks there are really strict on protocol. So you need to know the protocols coming in. And there was a bunch of us Indigenous folks from Canada, and we got invited up to the marae. And we started walking up there, and they're like, stop. And they came over and they were like, the women have to walk first or else you're declaring war. So we didn't realize that, but the first couple of minutes in New Zealand, we declared war on the Maoris from the Indigenous folks coming from Canada. So these ideas of protocol are really important. So it could be similar if you're paddling into Musqueam territory, not putting your paddles up in the air. People may think you're coming for other reasons rather than as friends or coming from peace. And I think the way that we can think about the work we're doing here today and the work that you're doing in your district in this is, how do we come from a position of peace with each other? Because I think the way, in my opinion, the change really happens from places of care. Change really happens from places of collaboration. And unfortunately, sometimes I've seen social justice work being taken up from this really aggressive standpoint, where you're being really aggressive and assertive with people and kind of like shaming them in the process. And to me, that like pushes people away from the work too often. And this doesn't mean we're going to avoid difficult conversations. That doesn't mean we're going to avoid talking about colonization and the ways in which we personally have participated in it. We're going to have those difficult conversations, but we're going to do that from a position of care. We're going to do that from a position of collaboration. And that welcomes more people into the circle. And that's really what we want to do. How can we bring more people into the circle and educate them about these things and have them personally take responsibility and take it up? And I think it comes from those paddles up in the air. If I come into your community and I have my paddle up and say, hey, let's talk about decolonization, my paddle up in the air, that's more welcoming than if I come in like wagging my finger at you, telling you the business for an hour here. That's not at all how I want to approach it. You know, my approach is to come with excitement to bring people into the circle, to get people engaged within this work. So my hope is that you leave this hour feeling excited, not feeling like I put you through the ringer for an hour, just made you feel horrible and made all these accusations, but instead coming with my paddle up and taking that teaching from the Musqueam folks. So to me, you know, when I think about, there's a lot of questions that we get about Indigenous knowledge is these fears of appropriation. These fears of like, what do I have the right to take up and what do I not have the right to take up? And the way that I think about it in a couple of ways, which we'll get into a little bit later, is we don't have the right to enact the ceremonies, the protocols of these communities. That would be overstepping. But the underlying teachings that we learn from folks, those are the things that we're being encouraged to take up. So we wouldn't have the right to reenact a Musqueam ceremony together because none of us are knowledge keepers in that space. We don't have those rights. But those underlying teachings that are connected to those are the things that we're being encouraged to take up through indigenizing processes. Otherwise, we need to be given direct permission and being directed in the ways in which we do those things. So similarly, like in my territory, you know, a really important component of the Bathalat system is transparency. You know, decisions are made in public spaces so that everybody knows how you came to a consensus. Well, as a school, we wouldn't have the right to reenact a potlatch without the proper guidance from people, but we'd have the right to embody those underlying teachings that get taught in those moments and find ways to meaningfully take those up. So that's what I've attempted to do through taking this, learning this teaching from Diamond Point, this Musqueam previous NITEP student, and then sharing that with you folks of the ways in which we're going to engage with our teaching and learning today. So building on top of those knowledges that we learned from the Musqueam, I want to bring you some knowledges from my community before we get into reconciliation. And witnessing is like one of the foundational ways in which I sort of envision teaching and learning. And how do we use witnessing from an Indigenous standpoint to create pedagogy, to teach and learn within different spaces? So I've used witnessing as the primary pedagogy in the mandatory course we designed at University of Calgary for all education students who take a mandatory Indigenous course. I've used it with the Federation of Social Services. I've used it with principal groups. It's in a couple of schools in the province now. This idea of like what it means to be a witness within different Indigenous communities is so foundational into the ways in which I envision education. You know, can we ask students to position themselves as being witnesses within the classroom? And there's this big process that we used at University of Calgary in order to use this as a pedagogy, got permission from all sorts of folks, got direction from different Indigenous communities. And I won't get into all that today, but each week we share a different Indigenous group's perspective on what it means to be a witness. And that directs the students in the ways in which they learn from each other, the ways they engage with each other. And so that students like learn from so many different Indigenous groups throughout the term on how to, and then get to enact those knowledges that are being shared. So one of the ones that I want to share with you is the one that comes from my community. And this comes from my cousin, Terry Lynn, whose Utsa name is Yabali. She is one of the heads of the Frog Clan in my community. And she shared this knowledge with us about what it means to be a witness within our territory. And I think like for you folks, witnessing this learning that we're having today, these teachings that we're creating, they can direct you on how can you be a witness to this learning that you're engaging with in this session or for this day or in this work in general. So what it says is the very act of witnessing and being a witness is integral to humanity. It is acknowledging events and the truth. It is acknowledgement of importance requiring ceremony of validation and displays of gratitude, thanks, and appreciation. In context of this approach, it is acknowledging the act and process of being a witness as ceremony on sacred. As witnesses, we listen attentively with our minds and our hearts as affirmation that what we are seeing and hearing is significant. So we have this really clear direction from my perspective from this Dakath ways of knowing about what it means to be a witness. So if we think of like the difference between how you'd be a witness in like a legal context, if you were in court, that would be very different. They wouldn't be asking you to do those things. So we need to understand those differences of the ways different groups take on that role of being a witness. And I think there's so many knowledges that we can sort of pinpoint here. We could use this one quote as like the foundation of so many things we could do. But I think today, one of the great directions we're getting is that Terry Lynn says, you know, for Dakath folks, as witnesses, we listen with our minds and our hearts. So we're not just using our mind, we're not just thinking analytically. And this is something that I need to be reminded of all the time because I'm a very analytical thinker. I like create frameworks in my mind whenever I'm listening to people talk. And it's how do I step outside of that and allow my heart to hear things as well? How do I not just rely on the analytical in order to understand things, to process things through the emotional and heart way of seeing it? So can we do that in the learning that we're doing today, which is like, can we listen with our heart sometimes? In addition, what she's saying is, by doing this, we're affirming that what we are seeing and hearing is significant. So by being a witness to something, we're giving validation to that. We're saying, this is important for me to be here. So like for us in our ceremonies, it's thinking it's important for me to be here to witness somebody getting a name. It's important for me to be here to witness this headstone going up. And it's saying this is an important ceremony for me to attend and to be witness to. So for us in this moment, we're saying, if what we're focusing on is like reconciliation or decolonization, for you as a witness, you're saying it's important for me to be here to learn more about this, to be able to engage in this process. By the act of witnessing, it brings power to it. It recognizes it as something that is important for us to do. So this isn't just something that goes on the PD calendar for the year. This is something that we recognize. This is an important part of my responsibilities as an educator. And regardless of what role you play as an educator in the district, it's saying, I have a role to play within this work. I have a role to play in equity. I have a role to play in human rights in the school. I have a role to play in decolonization and reconciliation. Every single one of us has a role to play in it. And by us being witnesses to that, we are recognizing that responsibility. And I think, in addition, we're being witnesses to one another, taking up that responsibility. And we're being witnesses in the journey that folks take when they enact that as well. So I think it's a really good direction for us to start in. And, I want to really model, like, how can we engage with Indigenous knowledges and then actually enact them in our practice? And this, for me, is like a really clear direction on, here's an Indigenous knowledge that we get from Terry Lynn, and here's the way in which we're going to actually embody it today. So it removes like how people are unsure of how to actually embody some of these things. And, we have knowledge keepers coming into your classroom, into your school all the time, and think of how often they're sharing things like this. And there needs to be that intentionality of like, how do we translate these things? How does it begin to emerge in my classroom and not just stay on that day that it was being taught? A colleague of mine, Lindsay Morecambe out of Queens, talks about the difference between indigenizing and incorporating. And she says incorporating is when we engage with Indigenous knowledges and it only stays in that moment that we talk about it. And she says indigenizing is when we engage with Indigenous knowledge and it radiates outward beyond that moment in which it was initially shared. And we start to embody those teachings, those ways of knowing outside of just that moment. And what I've witnessed too often, and it's a learning process, but in schools where they, bring in these knowledge keepers and they share these beautiful, elegant knowledges, and there's not that intentionality of, all right, how do we embody this outside of just this moment in which it was shared? How do we be intentional and recognizing these knowledges outside of just this moment? And that's how we differentiate between incorporating and indigenizing. All right. So the two concepts we're going to primarily look at today is the idea of reconciliation and the idea of decolonization. And sort of the way that I envision it is reconciliation is this space that we want to inhabit. So this space that we're trying to get to. And the two streams we can take to get to that space are the streams of decolonization and the streams of indigenization. And what I contend is most schools have begun taking on the work of indigenization, which is, including embodying Indigenous knowledges into typically colonial spaces. But fewer schools have undertaken the meaningful work of decolonization because it's far more complicated and it's far more difficult. But these are the two streams we can use to access this space of reconciliation, is what we're trying to inhabit. So to start out with it, I think it's important to differentiate, or to sort of challenge some of the prevailing ideas of what we mean when we say reconciliation, and to also challenge some of the ideas of what we're reconciling for. With a lot of the places that I work with and a lot of folks that I talk to, when we talk about what does reconciliation mean to you, we start to hear it become a synonym for an apology. And while that's a component of reconciliation, unquestionably, that does not make up the entirety of reconciliation. That's just one part of it. And when we start discussing as well about like what it is we're reconciling for, a lot of times the perspective is very limited to people thinking we're reconciling only for residential schools or only for the abusive components of residential schools. Of course, that's a huge component of it, and there needs to be reconciliation for that. But it's not just reconciliation for this one manifestation of colonization. There are so many other ways in which colonization has and continues to emerge in society that harms Indigenous people. And reconciliation is not merely only apologizing for past emergence of colonization and past emergence of harm. It's undoing and disrupting the current forms of harm that are still happening in Indigenous communities. So instead of viewing it as an apology for something that's happened in the past, it's a disruption of the present and the harmful ways in which colonization and oppression still impact Indigenous people. So what Marie Sinclair says is reconciliation is about creating a relationship of mutual respect. That relationship is the thing that we're focusing on when we think about reconciliation. And the thing that we need to understand is residential schools weren't an aberration. Based on the relationship that existed between those communities, based on the ways in which Indigenous folks were devalued, their knowledges are delegitimized, they're dehumanized, it shouldn't be surprising that residential schools happened. That's in line with the way in which the country saw Indigenous folks. That's not surprising those institutions happened because, we were devalued, dehumanized, delegitimized in all these different ways. Residential schools is one emergence of that relationship. We can also see like the 60s scoop is an emergence of that relationship. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is an emergence of that relationship. Differential treatment in like healthcare, the justice system, education, that's an emergence of that relationship. That underlying relationship feeds all these negative things that are happening. And the disruption of that relationship is what's necessary to stop the continual emergence of these harmful things happening. So when we engage with these ideas of reconciliation, it's how do we change this underlying relationship that's leading to so much harm for Indigenous folks? How do we fundamentally challenge that relationship that exists, that has existed for so long and has continued to cause harm? So if in reconciliation, all we were doing was seeing it from that lens of an apology and apologizing only for those historic events, then we don't have to take any personal responsibility for that because most of us were involved in that system and most of us wouldn't have reproduced that system. But if instead we begin expanding our understanding of reconciliation to the multifaceted ways in which colonization harms people into the problematic relationship that exists, then we have to start taking some personal responsibility because we are participating and contributing to that relationship. We are participating and contributing to those systems that continue to harm Indigenous folks. And the really complicated thing for so many of us is that working in like the field of education, once we take on these roles, we begin carrying some of the legacies of the system in which we work in. And the legacy of our system is really clear in the ways it's harmed Indigenous folks. And how do we reconcile that both as like Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks? How do we reconcile taking on this history of the institution in which we represent? And I'm sure many of you had this experience where people are not trusting of you in our roles, and justifiably not trusting because the history of the system in which we represent was not trustworthy. They shouldn't trust the system in the ways in which people have engaged with it historically. And then people make those assumptions about us because we now represent that system. And for so many of us, that can be so hurtful because our values are so fundamentally opposite to that. Yet people are sort of making these assumptions about the ways in which we'll engage with them, the ways in which we'll be truthful, all these sorts of things. But I think if we're thinking about the lens of equity, we have a responsibility to overcome the histories of our system. And we have to understand it's going to take a lot of work to regain that trust back. And, even if we are doing like wonderful work and we're using decolonial approaches, it's still going to take a lot of trust building in order to bring some of the community in to engage with some of this work because of this history in which we've now taken on the roles that we have. And I think when we also think about reconciliation, we have to be really specific to what roles do the system in which I work in play in the continual harm that's happening. I was working with a group of physicians not too long ago, and they were talking about what they're doing to reconcile. And I say, well, you're actually trying to reconcile for like fundamentally only residential schools. What role has medicine played in colonization? What are the ways in which medicine continues to enact colonization against Indigenous folks? An act of reconciliation would be disrupting those ways in which you're still perpetuating these ideas today and still causing harm today. So I think for schools, we need to think about in what ways are we continually causing harm for Indigenous folks? In what ways are we still carrying this uneven and oppressive relationship between communities, and how can we disrupt those things and stop those things from happening? Again, reconciliation is about disrupting the present as much as it is about acknowledging the past. And there's still so many things out there that we need to reconcile for. And again, this is coming from a position of care, coming from a position of peace, coming from a position of collaboration, myself included, have to continually learn and be able to understand differently the ways in which we can approach this work. So now we're going to get a chance for some of the folks on the Zoom to do a little bit of participating with us. In a lot of the sessions that I do, I want to give some space for some folks to name some acts of reconciliation they've witnessed in the last years, because one thing that I hope people recognize is that we've made a great deal of progress in the last 5 to 10 years. In the last 20 years, there's been a huge amount of progress in terms of like awareness, recognition, openness for change. While we're not at that place of like completely at that place of reconciliation, there's still a great deal of work to do. We would be doing a disservice not to acknowledge the growth that's happened and not to acknowledge the success of the work like folks like you in this call and folks like you who are watching this recording have participated in. And I think it's really important for us to name it, one, so that we don't fall in that trap of being cynical, because real change is happening. Second, I think when we hear these stories of reconciliation, it gives us direction on things we can do in our own educational spaces. Hey, I heard this person share this story. Why don't I try that in my classroom? Because I think it's a really excellent opportunity. And it moves this space from like me just talking at you for an hour to like people creating knowledge together. Because by no means do I think I'm the one who holds all the knowledge in this space, and that we don't have brilliant people on this call who haven't done remarkable things in their own spaces as well. So I think, and this is what I do at the beginning of sessions I do with like ongoing work I'm doing with different schools and organizations, is we start with what's an act of reconciliation that you've witnessed. So when we think about that, we want to think, what's a sign that the relationship is changing? Not just dismantling some manifestation of colonization, but a sign that the relationships are starting to change in society and people are seeing things differently. So one of the ways in which I'll start us out is, I think I was just in Cranbrook yesterday and the day before, and I was there on September 30th, not last year, but the year before. And for anybody who's been there, they have reclaimed their residential school, and they turned it into like a hotel, golf course, casino. And on September 29th, I stayed there, and September 30th, I gave a talk for their whole district. And it's kind of eerie being in there a little bit. And then we had a dinner on the 29th, and we were in what used to be the chapel of the residential school. And I was there with all these survivors, and somebody got up at the beginning and they were speaking in Tanaha, which is their language in that territory. And they were, one of the survivors leaned over to me and said, I couldn't have imagined anybody speaking Tanaha in this place. Like, never mind that building, but that specific space in that building. So it seems like something small, but it's a big sign of reconciliation in which there are no longer spaces where we can't proudly speak our language anymore. These spaces which would have been unimaginable years ago to even whisper any of our language, people are proudly speaking it in this place. To me, these are signs of reconciliation, signs that we're changing. Another one that I'll share is, and I think people say like, this is really small and it ends up being remarkable. And these are the ones I'm really looking for, is these small signs of it. And I was doing a session with the Friendship Center in Prince George, who I worked with for a couple of years now. And one of the people was saying that leading up to September 30th, their partner was like, worked in a blue collar environment in a shop. And people in the shop were speaking really disparagingly about this day coming up. And were really criticizing the fact that it's being recognized. And on the 30th, that person just wore an orange shirt into work. By no means do I think on October 1st, everybody thought differently and they were all on board with this work, but it's disrupting those spaces. It's saying, hey, some people in this space do care about this. Some people do value it. And that injecting of a different perspective into these spaces that are hostile towards it, that's a sign of reconciliation for me. People are challenging spaces that historically have been out of bounds for us to have these conversations. These are signs of reconciliation for me. And those are just a few, so I wanted to open it up for some other folks. Anybody have any moments of reconciliation they've witnessed in the last weeks, months? Any moment, big or small, it's the sign of like this underlying relationship is beginning to change. Something's changing here. You know, any thoughts? Anything anybody wants to share? Mike, yeah.
Yeah, I can share something. Interesting conversation, because I've been sitting, and it's not exclusive to this one group that I was witnessing. But the conversation was, they were sitting around and they were all non-Indigenous folks, having conversations around how to include Indigenous voice in the conversation, and they were decision makers. It was a really interesting conversation because it really evolved right in that sitting of a conversation that was only a couple of hours. It went to, do we appoint an Indigenous person to sit on in our group to add that voice, which is a step in itself. Then it evolved from, okay, how do we go about doing that so it's not just a token Indigenous person and a token voice, and how do we also reconcile with the fact that there are many Indigenous voices, and who represents all of those voices, and what does that look like in our organizational structure? And it even went a step further in that the conversation then evolved to, okay, here we are, a group of non-Indigenous folks, decision makers, trying to make the process, which is a really Western colonial process, on adding a voice, and adding a voice in a system that is really constructed with the Western or colonial concept. They never did land on how to do it. They just know they would like to add voice to their decision-making process. But I said to them after, I said, you know what, probably even a year ago or 2 years ago, I don't know if I would have heard the evolution of that conversation. And it really, it warmed my heart, even though they didn't land on a place that resolved it. But they're going to continue the conversation on how to include Indigenous voice in an authentic and a way that's valued among a group that is non-Indigenous. And they admitted at the end through their conversation that they were rooted in colonial thinking or Western thinking.
Excellent. Wonderful example. So these power structures that as recently as a couple of years ago would not have been like aware of and educated to think about not only inclusion of Indigenous folks, but like meaningfully thinking about how do we not tokenize that? You know, there's scholars who write about that within academia, which is that like representation alone does not mean we've gotten to these spaces of reconciliation. It's what does that representation look like, and how is that representation empowered in those spaces? So wonderful sign of it. Any other one that anybody wants to share, a moment of reconciliation? Yeah, Bernice, I wasn't sure if you were clapping at first or you had your hand up. So.
That was a hand up.
Okay.
So we've really been fortunate to have Phyllis Wagstad come and be part of the school district when she wrote the Orange Shirt Day. And so like I think that was like 5 years ago now, she came across the whole school district and many of the elementary schools. She presented the book. And so the kids got to experience it from the lady that wrote the book, Phyllis. And I think that really put a light on the day and she actually even helped Truth and Reconciliation Day by having it as a national day and going to Ottawa. And it's so amazing that here Phyllis is from the Canoe Creek, Dog Creek area of the Secwepemc Nation. And she's like here in our territory doing this amazing work, working in the school district. You see how the kids are so open-minded to that day, and they're bringing these shirts out and they're wearing it proudly. And, you know, I think it's so important that, you know, we started with the Truth and Reconciliation, but it even grew that much more. And even the impact of the 215 found on the Kamloops-Secwepemc hit it home as well for a lot of people, because they're realizing that the stories and what the elders talked about from, you know, the residential schools is true. And so people are becoming more aware of all that. And so they're more engaged in the, truth and reconciliation for the First Nations people everywhere across Canada and in the United States. So I really think it's amazing. And it's been, even when Murray Sinclair was coming across Canada doing the truth and reconciliation, I knew it was an important day for me to be at TRU when he was presenting. And so, I've been following along right from pretty much day one. And, and it's amazing because I remember Trudy was with me when we were at one of the schools when Phyllis first came out there, and the book's really impacted many people. And, I don't know if it's just, BC, but I really feel it in the school district. So Cookstown.
I see. Yeah, I think like that's one of the biggest signs I typically see in a lot of places, that the willingness and the excited way in which young people are engaged with this process. And you go to like a grade 3 school and they knew more than I knew coming out of my undergraduate degree about reconciliation, about the histories of colonization. That's not even like hyperbolic. That's like actually true. Unquestionably, the amount of things that are being taught to the young folks now. So like you go into those places and it, sometimes when you run into people who are from an older generation, they may see it as like more about this, or like they might feel like it's like this onerous thing, but you see young people and there's this like excitement about engaging with it. I go into classrooms and like kids can't wait for their turn to do the land acknowledgement. Kids can't wait to share their knowledge with their families about these things. So think about where these kids are going to be when they're in grade 12, when they're like 30, 40 years old, the amount of knowledge they're going to hold, unquestionably a great sign of reconciliation. So do we have anybody with the last one that they want to share in the moment of reconciliation since in the last while? Trudy, I think you had your hand up there for a second. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Thought I unmuted it. Yeah, as I was saying, it's a simple one. Like you were mentioning, I have been in this position for 5 years, and so I visit a lot of classrooms. And when I first started, I would sort of go in and then ask students, do you know the name of the traditional name of the territory that we live in here? And almost nobody, from K to 7, knew. The odd one. Now I go into classrooms and all the hands go up. They can at least say they are in Kamloops, or they can say they're in the Secwepemc territory. Some of them say they're in the Secwepemc Kulu. And yeah, in 5 years, it's gone from this to everyone. And even I have teachers so excited to share their resources with me. So like even like this little, this little picture of some traditional homes. She was so excited, this teacher, to give this to me, this grade 1 teacher. Hi, Colin. I said, thank you. So yeah, just the excitement on everybody's part to feel that connection to this territory and to be proud of that they're a part of it too, right?
Yeah, no question. I think so. Like for those teachers or educators that they're listening and not sure where to start, we just got 3 really great directions on somewhere where you can start. From Mike, it's saying, how do we include Indigenous folks in decision-making processes? How do we think of authentic ways to do that that's not just tokenized? If you're not sure where to start, that's somewhere to start. From Bernice, it's thinking about, we have kids who are truly valuing and interested in these sort of forms of reconciliation, of recognizing, some of the harms that were caused. Can we establish that within our classroom? From Trudy, we hearing about students like caring about the place in which they live and the names in which have been here for a long time, and recognizing Indigenous relationships to that. These are 3 really clear things that you can do in your space. If you're saying, hey, I want to take up this work, here's really clear direction on like relatively things you could do in the short term, I think, in a lot of these places. So I think hearing these accounts and hearing these ways in which we've recognized it, give the rest of us direction on where we can begin. I'm really a incremental thinker. I think that too often we get ourselves in like revolutionary mindsets where we think that like this one thing's going to change everything and it's going to be totally different the next day. No, it's the accumulation of the things that were just named. If we have these schools now where students are wanting to know about these histories and acknowledge these histories, if we have schools where students care about the place they live and the Indigenous views of those places, if we live in a place that includes Indigenous people in decision-making in meaningful ways, these are the incremental changes we need to get to the place of reconciliation we want to inhabit. So I think these are really wonderful directions that we've been given here on ways we can start taking it up. All right, so I'm going to teach you about decolonizing in 20 minutes. It's going to be a record timing. So when I talk about, this work of reconciliation, of getting to this space, I talked about these two streams that we can use. And indigenizing, we're not going to go into today because I think it's easier to comprehend of like, how do we embody Indigenous knowledges within our practice? So the direction I gave to you of the Musqueam knowledges of coming in peace, that's an indigenizing process. The direction I gave you in terms of embodying Dekath perceptions on being a witness, that's an indigenizing process. It's embodying Indigenous knowledges within a typical colonial space. That's what we mean by that. And schools are oftentimes doing that. And there's lots of learning we can do around that work as well. But I think it's widely understood more than decolonizing. So the way in which I conceptualize decolonizing comes down into three different areas. And we'll have a quick discussion about these to help you understand. And it should always be leaning towards the practical. What does this look like in my classroom? What does this look like in my school? What does this look like in my role within the school district? How can I embody these ideas? So promise you, we're going to all understand what these three mean by the end of it. So the first one is challenging the single viewpoint or story that defines, interprets, and normalizes knowledge, experiences, and people. Sounds complex. What it's basically saying is whose story matters, whose voice matters, whose truth matters. Colonization has told us there's only one group's voice and story who matter. It's the perspective of European Canadians, folks from the West. Those are the perspectives that matter. So we think of like the education that most of us went through. If we think of the histories that we learned, we didn't learn any histories from Indigenous perspectives. We didn't learn those viewpoints of our people and the ways in which we experience these moments in history. It was only the viewpoint of one group that we learned from. And this isn't saying that viewpoint from the West is wrong, but it's only one viewpoint. It's only one way of viewing the histories and the world and the truths that are associated with that. So colonization has taught us these are the only stories that matter. These are the only perspectives that matter. So through the work of decolonizing, we're not removing those perspectives. We're saying, hey, there's other perspectives and truths out there that are equally important and we need to learn about. That's an act of decolonization. By including those other viewpoints and stories and saying these are equally valid and equally important for us to learn about. One of the ways in which I learned about this was a couple of years ago, I was in Los Angeles and I went to this art exhibit and they had this work from this artist named Charles White. And this is his work right here. And there are these huge murals that he does. And in his work, we see this like representation of Blackness in there. And he's a Black man from Chicago, did a lot of his work in the early part of the 20th century. And in the exhibit, there was an interview playing with him at the same time. And what he said was, when I was a kid, any representation that I saw of Blackness was the ways in which we were viewed from the outside, not the ways we viewed ourselves. And he said the representations that I saw in film and the media and all these different things were Black folks as slaves, Black folks as criminals, Black folks as being lazy. And he's like, that's not how we saw ourselves. That's not our viewpoint in Blackness. And he says, our idea of being Black, we see the portrait here is of being parents, caring parents. We see the ones in the middle and the left-hand side. Our idea of Blackness is working with dignity and agency. We look at the bottom, our idea of Blackness is beauty from the way we see ourselves as being beautiful, not the ways we're seen as beautiful from the outside. So by him putting this out there in the world, it's an act of decolonization. It's that first act. It's saying, hey, our viewpoint matters. We get to define ourselves. And if we translate that into indigeneity, think about the ways in which you saw Indigenous people represented in media when you were young. How were they represented in film? How were they represented in newspapers and the news? Was that us? The way we see ourselves? Or was that the way we were viewed from the outside? And an act of decolonization is taking back that power to define who we are. Our truths matter. Our viewpoint matters. Our history, the way we view histories matter. I think about, there's a really horrible instance in the residential school where my family went to and was right in my territory in LeJac, where 4 boys ran away from the school in the middle of winter because they couldn't take it there anymore. And they froze to death on the way over there. And one of the boys made it back and they were talking to him and they said, they were trying to find out why they left. And they said they couldn't handle it at school anymore because there was too much abuse. It was too violent of a place. So it became like an infamous national story at the time. And the Indian agent was sent to the community to try to investigate this because there was pressure put on them. In investigating if this school was too harsh, the Indian agent did not go to the students, did not go to the parents of those Indigenous students. They went into town to talk to the non-Indigenous families who had no kids there, who had never been there, and said, hey, is that school too harsh? That's a clear act of colonization in that area of saying, hey, the people who have nothing to do with this, their voice matters than the people who are actually there. That's that clear act of colonization. So if we're thinking about that within our own educational spaces as it relates to this first one, it's how do we ensure that the voices and the viewpoints and the experiences of Indigenous folks matter in our classroom? What resources are we using to direct our knowledge? What historical moments are we seeing as being important? Whose voices are present in there? Whose truths are present in those moments? And this is not just for Indigenous folks, but all sorts of marginalized folks. You know, we can extend it to think about gender. We can extend it to think about other races. We can think about sexual orientation, gender diversity. We can think about class diversity, all these different things. Whose voices matter within these places? Who creates what we understand as truth in our educational spaces? Up until now, it's been one small group's perspective and experiences that have defined this seemingly objective history. And again, it's not saying that perspective is wrong. It's saying that's one way of viewing the world. There are all these other ways in which we can view it, and those should be included in our teaching and learning. And we should model for our students those perspectives and experiences matter as well in the classroom. Because the modeling that I received and the modeling that many of us received is our perspectives don't matter. Our viewpoints aren't relevant. And how many of us have internalized that idea and carried it into so much of the work that we do? For our students, just like we've disrupted this idea of them knowing about Indigenous histories, just like we've disrupted these ideas about caring about Indigenous names, can we disrupt this idea that only one viewpoint matters, only one truth matters? That's an act of decolonization. So we can think of the ways we can do that in your classroom or in your educational space. So the second one that we look at, and what the definition that I've used here is, disrupt the expectation or requirement that everyone adhere to the cultural norms, practices, and standards of the West, while being conscious of our tendency to evaluate others based on assumed shared cultural values. Again, sounds a little confusing at first. And what that sort of breaks down to is this idea that everybody is expected or required to embody Western cultures. It's our ways of being. We're expected to behave, think, and act in the way that people do in the West in order to be accepted within systems and within Canada. So we have to, communicate the ways folks do in the West. We have to organize our families in the ways in which people do it in the West in order to be recognized. And this quote here to me is really helpful in in directing us to understand this. And this is by James Baldwin, and this is coming from like an African American or Black context. And what he says is, assimilation was frequently but another name for the very special brand of relationship between human beings which have been imposed by colonialism. These relations demand that the individual, torn from the context to which he owed his identity, should replace his habits of feeling, thinking, and acting by another set of habits which belong to the strangers who dominated him. So this line in the middle, to me, sums up this component of colonization. And it also sums up like in a really important component of like residential schools or just colonial schooling in general, where it says we should replace our habits of feeling, thinking, and acting by another set of habits which belong to the strangers who dominated him. Don't think like this. Don't act like this. Don't speak this language. Don't pray in the ways that you do. Speak like us. Think like us. Act like us, and pray like us. So it's saying, leave behind all of your ways of being, and you have to act and think the way that we do. That's fundamentally what that is saying, is what that's telling us. And something that's really helpful for me to understand this a little bit deeper is to use this iceberg model of culture. And what this iceberg model of culture tells us is that most of the ways in which we engage with cultural differences in education and other public spaces is from the waterline up. So if we look at this model, we're seeing this big iceberg, we're seeing this tiny little bit sticking out above the water, and we have this huge portion that goes below the water. What they're contending is that when we talk about diversity, we only talk about the waterline up. We only talk about the differences in the foods that we eat. We only talk about the differences in the languages we speak, our celebrations, our clothes, mainly really visual aspects of cultural differences. We don't talk about the differences as it relates to body language, eye contact, tempo of work, tone of voice, attitudes towards elders. There's differences from every culture in the ways in which those are practiced. And again, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but the problem with colonization is we've been told there's only one way in which to see personal space. There's only one way in which we should see notions of modesty or relationships to animals. We're expected to adhere to the Western viewpoint on this. And that viewpoint is perfectly valid, but it's perfectly valid for people who come up in those communities, not for us who have totally different relationships to these ways of being. And colonization requires us to know and embody those other ways of being in order to be validated in society, in order to be successful in society. So often in schools, that's where this is first created for us. This is the appropriate way to have a tone of voice. This is the appropriate way for thinking of like tempo of work. We talked about that already. You know, visiting is not an acceptable thing to do at the beginning of a meeting for a while in lots of spaces. But for us, it is. For us, it would be inappropriate not to do that. So an act of decolonization is not knowing the way every culture does everything below the waterline, but it's opening up not to require people to adhere to the one way in which people do that in the West. And we think of like the myriad ways in which Indigenous folks have been harmed by that. If we think of school systems, how many times has there been a misunderstanding when a teacher reaches out home to an Indigenous family when these things below the waterline are a little bit different? And the teacher may interpret the parent's actions as being like assertive, may interpret their actions as being, not connected to it or not caring. And there might be a totally misunderstanding as it relates below the waterline. So the second aspect of decolonization asks us, how do we challenge this way in which spaces are all expected to be Western cultural values? How do we open up spaces and learn about the ways in which different cultures do these things? How is eye contact different in different spaces? One of my friends and colleagues, Adam Murray, who's an Apache scholar, said in his culture, you'd only look somebody in the eye if you wanted to fight with them or mate with them. So if you go into like a school environment and you're like looking folks in the eye, what message are you sending to them in that space? And those cultural differences are really important for us to know, because if we're going to engage with people, it shouldn't only be on our terms. We should open it up to have other cultural ways of being represented in there. And we can do that really slowly. We can just learn a little bit about like the differences in body language, eye contact, patterns of group decision-making, learning about a couple of these things and incorporating them into the ways we engage with community, into the norms we practice in our classroom. All these sorts of things are ways in which we can decolonize our space. And again, I think incremental thinking is so important here. We can't put pressure on ourselves to overthrow our whole classroom and do everything totally differently. Can I just challenge the way I'm doing a check-in in the morning with students, thinking of one of these? Can I challenge the way in which I'm calling home to parents or connecting with people? Can I challenge one aspect of my teaching next week and have this incremental thing? And it's important to understand this goal is not to replace everything Western with everything Indigenous. That's not the goal at all, because Western knowledges and ways of being are important to keep there, but they're not the only thing we should be doing there. We need to be opening up and democratizing it so other ways of being can be valued and practiced in these spaces, so students don't need to learn and go to schools and leave their entire culture behind in order to get an education. All right, the last one. This is the most controversial one for some folks because there's a misunderstanding of what we mean by this. This last one is dismantling white supremacy. And the important thing to differentiate between, because some people are going to get a real big reaction when they hear white supremacy. We need to differentiate between white supremacist and white supremacy, two very different things in how we think about it. And when most people hear white supremacy, they think white supremacist. They think of like KKK, neo-Nazis, these people who are like intentionally, overtly, and violently adhering to white supremacy. It's very different from white supremacy. The ideas of white supremacy are just these ideas that we create a hierarchy in society and see certain groups as more capable than other groups, see certain groups as more trustworthy than other groups, see certain cultural practices as more valuable than other ones. That's acts of white supremacy. So the third component of decolonizing is, how does white supremacy practice within our educational spaces? And I can give you an example of like, in my education in northern BC, in a community that was like 30% Indigenous, there was no representation of indigeneity whatsoever in my school. We might have like had a cameo in like discussions of the fur trade. But besides that, there were no meaningful representation of indigeneity in my school. So what the school was telling us is you can get a full education and you don't need to know anything Indigenous. You don't need to know anything about those histories, about the people, about their ways of being. You don't need any of that. You can be successful in society with only our knowledges. That's an act of white supremacy. That's saying this is what's important. All this stuff we're going to teach you, all this stuff is not important. We're either not going to teach it to you or it's going to be an elective. So if we think about that aspect of white supremacy, we need to think about most of the ways white supremacy is enacted is unconsciously. It's not these conscious things that we're doing of saying, hey, these people are better than these people, so I'm going to go and do this. 99% of white supremacy is unconscious. We're trained for so long in the way that I was as well, that these are the things that are important. These are the people that are capable. These are the people that are trustworthy. And when we're bombarded with these ideas over and over again, we begin to take them on and unconsciously align with them. So every one of us here in this call, everyone watching this call, we've all been impacted by this way in which we've been socialized to believe this. And again, this is not coming from a place of shame and blame. It's coming from a place of care, coming from a place of collaboration and recognition. This is work we all need to do to disrupt this because we've all been trained to see this. And the way that's helpful to understand that is through some research that I did. And this is the last thing that we'll look at. I was working with a community in northern Saskatchewan, an on-reserve community, and we were talking about decolonizing, talking about indigenizing, and I was telling them, like, we need to start with decolonizing, challenge our ways of thinking, and then we'll go into indigenizing. And these are all like Indigenous teachers in an on-reserve school, and they were like, well, we don't need to do decolonizing because we're all Indigenous here. We're not racist against ourselves. Let's go right to the indigenizing. I was like, well, we are, because we've been trained to have internalized oppression, and it's really important for us to do this. And they said, no, thanks. And being an academic, I was like, I'm going to research my way out of this problem. So I did this study where we showed these 8 images to students, kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2 in this on-reserve school. All Indigenous teachers, all Indigenous students in the school, relatively isolated, not much influence from non-Indigenous people at all. We asked them a series of positive questions. Which of these students are smart? Which of these students are good at many things? Which of these students would you like to be friends with? In this school, in kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2 students, when we asked these Indigenous students taught by Indigenous teachers, which of these students are smart, they pointed 81% of the time to the white students, 39% of the time to the Indigenous students. That's white supremacy. That's these students being trained and socialized unconsciously into white supremacy. They don't know these students. They've never met them. We went to such long lengths to find students with like similar attractiveness is a big thing in the research, similar levels of smiles, although the kid on the second from the top on the right has a massive smile and we just like didn't want to keep him out of the research. But the students at that young age were already trained and socialized into acts of white supremacy. They saw these students as being more capable than other students. That's white supremacy. And the thing that we need to realize that we do as well, and it's really hard for us to hear, myself included, we see these kids in the same way that those young students saw them as well. We've been socialized to view that in the same way. And we need to do that really intentional work in decolonization to disrupt that. We need to do that really, and we need to open ourselves up first to the possibility and the assuredness from my perspective that we have been trained in this way. And there's ways in which we unconsciously treat students differently. There's endless research that shows this. We treat students differently based on race, based on gender, based on class. That's a really big one that we don't think about. We treat students very differently based on class. So if we had a student whose parents were both doctors versus a student who was in care, we would automatically treat them differently because of the assumptions we hold towards them. And that differential treatment leads to differential success for those students. And it's the same for Indigenous students. So how do we disrupt and dismantle this? Well, it's first opening ourselves up to the possibility that we too participate in this and try to figure out how we can recognize our unconscious collusion with this and our unconscious reproduction with these things. So that's a really quick overview. We could spend months and months just talking about these 3 components and sort of getting deeper into these topics. But I think just an initial exposure is really powerful of thinking about those 3 different ways. 1, whose stories and viewpoints matter. 2, whose cultural practices are acceptable within public spaces and within the systems we work in. 3, how does white supremacy influence some of the ways in which we enact with students and folks in our schools? And if we think at each of these levels, there's like low-hanging fruit that we can begin to do in our classrooms, we can do in our schools. How do I open up so other voices matter? How do I model for our students that other voices matter and perspectives matter? How do I begin including other ways of being and the ways in which we teach, the ways we come together? And how do I model for our students that that's important, so that Indigenous students know their ways of being are important there, and non-Indigenous students know that other people's ways of being are equally important. And then lastly, how do we dismantle and disrupt white supremacy in our educational spaces? It's not easy at all. This is like a generational project that we're working on here, but slowly and slowly we can start disrupting. And I think in those future conversations that we have about what are signs of reconciliation that you've seen, if we start embodying some of these things, we're going to start seeing them in those signs of reconciliation. We're going to say, hey, here's a way in which other voices were seen to matter in this space. Hey, here's a way in which other cultural ways of being were included in our learning. Hey, here's a way in which we intentionally began dismantling white supremacy. So again, this is coming from a place of collaboration. I'm really of the viewpoint that, most, if not all of us, have the same perspective of like, we want what's best for our students. And it takes additional learning for us to figure out some of the additional things we need to do to provide an equitable system that's fair to all students. And, like I said, I'm incredibly optimistic about the direction we're going in, and the progress that I'm witnessing on a daily basis, the commitment I'm seeing from folks like those of you in the call right now and the folks watching, and just really thrilled to get to share some of this with you here today. And hopefully we'll get to cross paths again and have more of these conversations. So thank you so much.
Dr. Louis, just before we break off here, I really want to just thank you, Cookshem, on starting those thoughts and grounding us in the process. And even though some of these messages have started to emerge, it's great to have a moment and an opportunity to just kind of reground ourselves in the process. And I really appreciate what you said in all of these ways, but particularly the revolution kind of thought processes that we think we need to have all of the changes all at once. And really, you talked about decolonizing and even decolonizing ourselves, because in my mind that's another colonial way of thinking where we need to rush to the end to get that end product. But really, like you said, it's about the journey. And you today providing us with that awareness piece again, and that knowing piece, and then moving to that sensitivity and understanding. And then I think the next steps, which thanks to you, we'll unpack some of this and have conversations and talk about how we apply this. What does this look like in our classroom, in our school, in our district, and what is that small step we can make next to continue on that journey and learn from it, right? And then how do we act on it? So really, it isn't just about the conversation either today. It's about how do we act on the conversation today. That's really going to, I guess, that's part of the reconciliation, because the acting is the reconciliation piece of getting to where we need to be and where we need to be in the territories we're at, in the context we're at, in our classrooms, again, in our school and our district, and in the nation that we live on, and Secwepemcúlecw, the land that we live on, and those relationships and connections. So, Cookshetchumk, I'm optimistic that this won't be the last that we'll hear from you, and we'll get you back to have some more conversations. But thank you for starting us off in a great way today. Cookshem.
That's it, show.
And thank you folks for joining, and have a great rest of your day.